Well, it's needless to say that it's easier to display positive news rather than negative news. But sometimes we have to display negative messages. Even the best of businesses will make some mistakes. Sometimes goods may arrive late or may not be delivered at all. Products can fail. Some of our service people may mishandle some situations. People may not be billed correctly, or even worse, maybe billed twice. There can be some mishandling in some of the wares that we may keep. You might have to apologize for mistakes in missed orders or rudeness of employees, maybe defective products or jumbled instructions. In other words, every business person must occasionally deliver negative news. You may have to fire someone. You may have to do some downsizing. We see a lot of that in the news here lately. So the sting of bad news can be reduced by giving certain reasons, communicating sensitivity, and treating the receiver fairly, and using empathy. We'll talk about that here in a minute. With communication and with business, many times you're working with different cultures. Some of you will eventually be working with businesses that work with international groups. And different cultures communicate differently. And this can be said also by using negative news. Negative news is displayed differently with different cultures. For example, in Germany, business communicators occasionally use buffers, but tend to present bad news directly or using the direct approach. We've talked about that before in a couple of sessions. So far this semester, there's the direct and indirect approach. British writers tend to be straightforward with bad news, using the direct approach, seeing no reason to soften the announcement. In Latin countries, the question is not how to organize negative messages, but whether to present them at all. It's considered disrespectful and impolite to report bad news to superiors. Therefore, many reluctant employees may fail to report any incidents at all, especially to their bosses or their superiors. And in many Asian and Latin cultures, one must look beyond the individual's actual words. You really have to start looking at their nonverbal communication to find out what is being said. So the goals in communicating negative news and explaining clearly and acting professionally is being fair and maintaining professional and positive and friendly relations. So let's go on to the next slide and let's talk about this in a little more detail. Direct versus indirect. We've seen this in 3 or 4 sections already, and there's times where we use direct and there's times where we use indirect. When it comes to negative messages, yes, you can use both. For example, with direct, the direct strategy, when the negative news comes out first, may be more effective in situations that are not damaging. If there's going to be a change in service or a change in the policy, it's where something the receiver may just overlook. It's nothing very damaging. You're not firing somebody. You don't want to use the direct approach unless it's a special occasion to walk up to somebody and say, "Hello, Jan, sorry about this, but you're fired," and then walk off. That's using the direct approach, and probably not the very best approach to use for bad news. So we usually use the indirect approach, because the indirect approach can be used to soften the message a little bit. And if you look here on the screen, it says good news can be delivered quickly, but bad news may need a little more time. So let's look at a 4-part strategy for indirect usage when it comes to delivering bad news. If you look on this screen, you'll notice we have a 4-part series of words, and it starts off with buffering. Now, this is delivering negative messages using the indirect approach. Now, by buffering, we mean to open up with a neutral statement, meaningful but neutral, and you do not have to mention the bad news up front. Remember, that would be the direct approach. So you just want to make the reader curious about what you're getting ready to say, and you want the reader, if you're writing a memo or if it's an email, to continue reading. Therefore, this will allow the speaker to maybe open up with the best news, be positive, maybe use a compliment, or talk about the appreciation. You could even talk about an agreement with a contract. You can use some facts, but you don't want to get into the main course yet. Then that takes us to the second phase, which is the reasons. This is where we're going to explain the causes of the bad news. We're not disclosing the bad news yet, but we're going to explain the causes. We're going to explain why the bad news was necessary and that the matter is being taken seriously. We can explain the logic behind the bad news, provide some rational explanation using positive words, and displaying empathy. And if possible, we want to mention to the reader some of the benefits that we may be able to look into in the future. And then we get to the bad news itself. We've got to reveal the bad news. We don't want to emphasize it, but we want to reveal it. And this is where some of the exercises that we've worked on before, what type of words we can use. We want to maybe be passive, and this section talks about active and passive messages. We want to provide a clear, but we don't want to understate this announcement that the bad news might include. It could include some alternatives. The bad news may be able to include some kind of compromise. That is how we need to mold this message. And whenever we're delivering negative messages, this is something that you need to plan out if you have to do this at work. You don't want to just do it off the cuff. This is something that you need to plan out because you may be affecting relationships within the organization, without the organization. And then finally, we go to the closing. This is where we end with a personalized, forward-looking, and a pleasant statement. Avoid referring back to the bad news. We can end it with something that's warm. We may want to mention good wishes, a sales promotion, other alternatives. If appropriate, we could describe what will happen next. But the main thing is we want to end with a positive message, starting off with negative. Starting off with negative messages, and we're ending with something that's positive. And if you look on the screen, you'll see empathy versus sympathy. Is there a difference? Well, sure. Empathy, you're really feeling what the other is going to experience. Sympathy, you can say that you understand, but empathy, you're really understanding. For example, with empathy, you could say, we are sorry about the miscommunication. We're very embarrassed about our professionalism, but most of all, we are deeply sorry that this had to happen to you. You're using more empathy. You're concerned about that individual. And there's different ways that we can deal with disappointed customers. For example, if you look there on the screen, it says to call first. If it's possible, it's better to handle these situations over the phone than through an email, especially if you're just dealing with one person. If you call the individual, then you can describe the problem and apologize. For example, let's say if the person was double billed, you can say, We'd like to apologize for this problem. Our company is using a new program called Red Brick Program, and the Red Brick Program has been found to double bill patients from around the country. We have told Red Brick Company that we're giving them 2 weeks to fix this. If not, we're going to use another program. So it is our apologies. It is on our fault. It's our we're sorry for this. We want to continue our relationship. So you want to describe why it happened, and then you want to apologize. Then you want to maybe explain in some more detail why the problem occurred and assure them it will not happen again. We will make sure of that. And then you should follow up with a letter, with an email, or with another phone call. Because when customers' problems arises and the company is at fault, many business people usually try to use this method. And finally, here we see again, buffering, reasons, and bad news. This also should be used whenever you're dealing with negative messages inside the company. If you are working with another department or someone within your department, you must deliver bad news, and you should deliver bad news in person. There's been some companies that you've probably read about in the news where they've had to lay off thousands. There was a story where Boeing had to lay off 40,000 people. How do you deliver bad news to 40,000 people? Do you go to the supervisors and then they go to their supervisors and deliver this personally? Sometimes you have to deliver it through an email. Now companies are starting to deliver bad news with blogs. But if you're given the opportunity to deliver bad news and you want to deliver it in person, you can still use these 4 phases. But you should also, before you talk to the person, gather all the information. Remember that every story has 2 sides. This may be a position where 2 people are arguing. One person is accused of something. If you're the supervisor, one of the things that I've learned being in supervision is a lot of times you become a babysitter in some ways. Some organizations have cliques just like you had in high school. Then you want to prepare what you're going to say, rehearse what you're going to say. What do you think that other person may say in defense? You want to explain everything in full and detail. Don't leave anything out. Be positive. Use good voice control. And you may want to consider taking a partner. If it's just one person and another person, and you're talking to somebody in a closed office, the other person, especially if it's something bad, if they're accused of stealing, they can say something against you that isn't true. I know a district manager who runs 21 convenience stores. He says that whenever he has to approach someone to fire a cashier because they've been stealing money, he always reminds them in the interview that they're being recorded. There's video recording them all day long. And then the manager of that convenience store goes over the cash register tapes, and then he goes over the cash register tapes. And whenever they find somebody that has been taking $1 here or $1 there, or even giving one of their friends a free cola, he comes into that store and he sits in the office with the manager. There's always 2, a partner. Other times he's had to fire the manager because the manager was in on the stealing of the company. So he'll bring in an accountant. But he likes to use another person just because that other person can't be defensive and then try to bring the manager down. So there are times you may want to bring somebody in. And the big thing is to be patient. Give the receiver time to vent. Especially if it's something very bad, they're going to be defensive. But give them that time. They may calm down, and then you can talk about it later. Hopefully this section, this chapter in the text is helpful to you. If you haven't experienced this yet, you probably will. This is just part of business. This is what we have to do. So I hope you enjoy reading the text, and we'll talk about this in another section.